Hello everyone, have a nice day. Today we'll explore the gentle day, Uri and Tu Tieu and the peace they earned. A quiet, emotional chapter where truth finally stops shouting and begins to whisper. After hard truths are spoken, apologies are offered, and respect is shown. The village learns how to breathe again. This is a story of humility, healing, and love that chooses daylight. If you find this journey moving, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The raindrops on the bamboo eaves kept time like a soft drum. When the knock came 3 careful taps that felt older than the house. Uri stood in the doorway beside Tu Tieu, both of them haloed by gray light, when the visitor lifted her chin. A brown ao dai, a scarf wrapped bundle held to her chest. The face they remembered from the hearing under the banyan. "Is he here? Mr. Uri?" she asked. The voice was gentle, but it carried the weight of staying quiet too long. "He's inside," Tu Tieu said, a calm that hid the flutter at her throat. They brought her to the bamboo table near the window. The orchard outside wore a gold-tinged haze. Children's laughter trailed along the fence and faded like smoke. Uri came out drying his hands, mind racing to find the right shape for a sentence he hadn't rehearsed. He didn't find one. The scarf loosened. The bundle opened. A small pocket watch lay in the middle glass cracked, hands frozen at 2:17, a rust line like a healed wound across the numbers. "This," the woman said, "was found near the site after the collapse. He never came back for it." Uri felt the floor shift not under his feet, but in his chest. The watch wasn't ticking, yet the silence it made was loud. She sat, palms flat on the table, and looked at him with eyes that had learned to be still. "They told me my husband falsified the report, that it was his fault. I knew what he was, Mr. Uri, and what he wasn't. But truth is a door that sometimes opens when no one's standing there to push it." Crickets answered, thin threads of sound stitching the pause. Tu Tieu poured tea. Her hands didn't shake, but her breath did. "You said what needed to be said," the woman continued. "And now the village nods, like they always knew. Where were those nods 3 years ago?" She tried to laugh and found a breath instead. "My boy stopped saying his father's name at school." Uri opened his mouth, closed it. He could argue facts. He could not argue grief. "Does justice fix what silence breaks?" she asked. He bowed his head. "I don't know," he said at last. The truth was a blade, but so was delay. Both cut. The woman's mouth softened, almost into a tired smile, not cruel. "I don't hate you. I came to see the man who finally said the thing that wouldn't stop breathing in our house." Rain ticked a little steadier. Steam lifted from the teacups. The room smelled like wet soil and warm leaves. Somewhere, a late rooster forgot what hour it was. When she rose, she didn't take the watch. "He checked it every night before his shift," she said, placing her fingers lightly on the cracked glass. "Said time only means something if you know what you're working for." She left through the open gate. The wind caught a corner of her scarf and curled it like a small flag. When she turned down the lane, the house felt bigger and somehow more crowded. Uri remained at the table, eyes on the watch. "It was easier before the words were out," he said, voice rough, not from crying, but from holding back. "Now, everything echoes." "Then let it echo," Tu Tieu answered, pulling a chair beside him. "Echoes prove the room is real." She touched the back of his hand. "Pain isn't our enemy, forgetting it." He nodded. but it was the slow nod of a man learning to breathe around a new rib. He picked up the watch, traced the crack, and lowered it again like it could break twice. Afternoon thinned into evening. They quietly ate rice that stuck to the lid, fish that smelled like the river half a kilometer away. The rain gentled to a film. The orchard shimmered as if washed, then polished. Uri repaired the frayed corner of a tarp in the shed, fingers working, because hands understand what mouths can't. Tu Tieu rinsed cups, lining the mouth down like small white moons along the sill. "Stay," she said, when he passed her shoulder to hang the tarp. He paused. She didn't mean, "Don't leave the room." She meant, "Stay with me in this feeling. Don't outrun it." He leaned on the door frame, listening to the water bead, and slid off the eaves. What if the quiet after the storm is the scariest part? He asked. "Then we learn its language," she said. "We let it talk until it purrs." They fell into the hum of ordinary things. A loose floorboard that always complained. A gecko clucking somewhere behind the calendar. The neighbor's radio whispering a ballad with half its words eaten by static. None of it healed anything. All of it made healing possible. Later, the power flickered. The room held on to its shape by candlelight. Tu Tieu brought the ledger from the shelf, the ledger that had finally spoken, the ledger that had stopped a lie, that had kept too many mouths closed. She set it on the table with the pocket watch, the cracked glass catching a small, stubborn flame. "Tomorrow," she said, "we take it to her house. We don't knock and hand it over like proof. We bow. We let the pages rest where they belong." Uri's hand landed on the cover, palms spread like a pledge. "I tied my tongue for years. It will not knot again." A moth circled the candle. The wick hissed. Tu Tieu leaned in, cheekbone lit to a soft line. "You aren't the only one who spoke, Uri," she said. "You spoke, yes. But the village listened, and that's a kind of speech too, even if it came late." He looked at her and found in her eyes not the answer, but the warmth to carry a question. "You always make the room feel wider," he said. "You keep the door open," she replied. "That's our deal." They wrapped the ledger in brown paper, the way you cover a school book you hope a child will treat kindly. Uri tied it with a jute string, fingers steady now. He slid the pocket watch on top beneath the first loop, then paused. "Is this right?" "Right," she said, and moved the watch back onto the table. "This one you carry. Here." She took his palm, pressed the cool metal into it, then closed his fingers slowly, like tucking a baby to sleep. Midnight arrived like a soft footstep. The rain was gone, the sky a deep bowl, edges rimmed with star ash. In bed, they lay on their backs, the kind of quiet between them that only exists when two people have told each other the worst truths and stayed. Uri turned the watch in his hand, feeling the notch where the glass had bitten and dulled. "Tell me we earned this," he said into the dark. "This is gentle." "We earned this," Tu Tieu whispered, "not by winning, by refusing to hide." He smiled unseen. "Make me a promise." "What promise?" "When the next storm comes, it will remind me we know the way back." "I will," she said, "but I think the path is learning us too." A wind slipped through the shutters and threaded the room with an orchard smell. Something in Uri eased, not like a rope cut, but like a knot untangled. The pocket watch lay on the nightstand, not ticking, but he could swear the silence around it breathed differently now. Dawn didn't rush. It lifted the edge of the curtain, tasted the floor, then climbed the bedpost with patient light. Tu Tieu woke first, hair spilled across her shoulder, arm reaching before her mind did in finding his wrist. He stirred. "Morning," she said, voice like the first cup of tea. "Gentle day," he answered, and meant it. They dressed without hurry. His white shirt was clean, frayed at the inner cuff. Her black tee with the white collar she loved because it made every day feel a touch formal. He tucked the ledger under his arm, slid the pocket watch into his pocket. It bumped his hip like a living thing. They stepped outside. The path glittered with dew. Somewhere, a broom hushed a yard clean. Down the lane, a door creaked open and a kettle began to sing. Uri and Tu Tieu walked side by side, a pace that said they weren't late and weren't early. They were on time for whatever forgiveness looked like. At the bend, where the bamboo leans, they stopped and looked at each other, not searching for courage, but acknowledging it. He squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back twice. "Ready?" she asked. "Not really," he said, and smiled. "But it's time." They turned toward the small wooden house at the end of the lane. Paint faded to the color of old rice paper. A door left half open in the morning. The ledger pressed warm against his ribs. The watch rested cold against his pulse. And the gentle day spread its light across the path ahead. The house at the end of the lane was smaller up close, its porch boards whitened by sun and years. Incense unfurled from a clay bowl near the door, the smoke rising in thin ropes that drifted and dissolved. Uri paused on the step, the ledger firm beneath his arm, the pocket watch a cool weight against his hip. Tu Tieu's hand found the small of his back not pushing, just reminding. Inside, the altar waited with its modest grace. A framed photo of Mr. Kai in his factory uniform, a dish of rice and salt, a cup of tea still warm enough to cloud the porcelain. 2 incense sticks burned unevenly, one shorter by a thumb's width. Morning light poured in sideways and turned the dust to floating gold. Mrs. Kai stood near the doorway with sleeves rolled to her elbows, as if she'd been about to scrub the floor and thought better of it. Her eyes flicked to the wrapped book, then to Uri's face. Neither spoke until they bowed. Uri set the ledger carefully before the frame and knelt. His voice was steadier than last night's, though the words still felt new against his tongue. "I should have spoken sooner," he said. "The weight you carried was never yours. I am sorry for every day I let silence do my work." His apology did not bounce back. It laid itself down in the room and stayed. Tu Tieu bowed too, her hair slipping forward, then straightened with a breath that shook only once. For a quiet stretch, the only sounds were the soft crackle of incense and a kettle far away, starting to think about boiling. Mrs. Kai stepped closer, the lines of her face rearranging themselves from suspicion into something softer. She touched the paper cover of the ledger, then lifted it open at the back. The last page was blank, a square of white catching sunlight. "He used to say, 'The truth finds its way,'" she murmured. "I thought the road had washed out." Tu Tieu smiled, small and sure. "Sometimes the road pretends to be a river until we learn how to cross." The older woman let out a breath that carried 3 years of grit with it. A single tear ran down. Not dramatic, just true. "Leave it here," she said, but then reconsidered and nudged the book gently back toward Uri. "No, take it to the village hall later." Let the office hold the proof. Let my house hold the peace. She reached into the pocket of her ao dai and drew out the pocket watch. And this, she added, placing it in Uri's open palm. He checked it before every shift. If forgiveness has a sound, maybe it's time starting again. Her fingers closed over his hand, warm and dry, the gesture more blessing than return. Uri's throat tightened, the way it does when relief is almost too big to swallow. "Thank you," he said. "I am not thanking you for what you did," she answered, eyes clear now. "I'm thanking you for what you didn't do today. You didn't come here to defend yourself. You came to bow. There is a difference." They lit 2 new incense sticks together. The smoke braided, then separated, one thread leaning toward the open window as breeze entered and left like a guest who knew the house well. When the 3 of them stepped back onto the porch, the light had rounded into late morning. Word travels without feet. On the lane, a few neighbors glanced up from sweeping. One old man nodded, the kind of nod that says both "I see" and "I won't shout." A stray dog trailed after them for a few steps, then veered off toward a sun patch. The day was doing its work. At the bend by the bamboo, a young mechanic from the wood shop, a boy Uri had trained last season, approached, cap in both hands. He looked from Uri to the parcel under his arm. "Boss," he said, then seemed to decide the word wasn't right anymore. Brother, some of us are drawing up new safety checks for the planning room." The old list didn't ask the right questions. "Will you look?" There it was, the old fear returning to test the door. Uri tasted the instinct to lecture, to prove, to measure worth with solutions. He let it pass. "Bring it this afternoon," he said. "We'll write it together, and it won't just live on a wall. It'll live in what we do." The boy's shoulders loosened. "Duh. Yes." He jogged away, already practicing the conversation under his breath. Uri and Tu Tieu kept walking until the lane opened to the orchard. The grapefruit trees wore a soft sheen, each leaf a tiny mirror. They stopped at a sapling that had survived last month's wind by bending instead of breaking. Uri brushed soil away from the roots, then pressed the earth back firm. "For him," he said. "For him," she echoed. They didn't specify which truth made the pronoun wide enough for both the man in the photo and the man standing here. Back at the house, the day continued its gentle proof. They cooked a simple lunch, morning glory with garlic, rice, a small pan of eggs done just this side of creamy. They ate on the floor with the door open. A neighbor's baby laughed at nothing and everything. After, Tu Tieu mended the fray on Uri's shirt cuff with a thread so close in color it felt like time stitching itself. Uri sanded the edge of a loose board on the porch. Long passes that smoothed splinters, both wood and human. The mechanic returned with 2 other workers and a scribbled sheet. They sat under the jackfruit shade, debating where to place mirrors. What checklist item should require 2 signatures? How to make the emergency stop obvious enough to hit in panic. Uri didn't dominate. He asked questions that brought the room forward. When they finished, they signed all 3 names at the bottom. "So it won't be one man's truth," he said. "It will be ours." When they'd gone, the village head appeared with his ledger, another ledger, older than the orchard itself. He thanked Uri in the way officials do, short on poetry, long on meaning. He asked if the factory would allow a memorial shelf by the north entrance, a photo, a nameplate, a rule printed large enough to cast a shadow. Make the rule simple, Tu Tieu suggested. No silence when safety is at risk. The headman wrote it down without looking up, as if the pen had been waiting. Afternoon softened. Uri and Tu Tieu walked to the hall. They handed the wrapped ledger to the clerk, who logged it with a steady hand and slid it onto a shelf that already understood responsibility. When they stepped back outside, the sun had begun its honeyed descent. At the market, they bought chrysanthemums and a handful of limes, because peace asks for small altars too, ones that live on windowsills and next to stoves. A woman selling herbs pressed extra mint into their bag with a wink that meant everything and nothing. On the way home, a man who used to mutter when Uri passed stopped them. I said foolish things, he admitted, not quite meeting their eyes. I was loud with the wrong story. Uri considered the many versions of reply available to him. He chose the smallest. Thank you for telling me, he said. The man nodded, grateful for the easy shape of the forgiveness he'd been offered, and turned toward his own gate. Evening arrived on bare feet. Uri and Tu Tieu brewed tea. They carried 2 cups and the chrysanthemums to the altar they'd kept for their own dead, and set a third in the window for anyone the village had ever misnamed. They didn't talk much. Sometimes the most loving sound is porcelain against wood. Later, on the porch, they watched the color drain from the sky until it pooled in the bases of the trees. Fireflies switched on like patient punctuation. Uri took the pocket watch out, turned it over, and this time did not check the frozen hands. He closed it and let it warm in his palm. Do you hear it? Tu Tieu asked. What? The quiet, she said, leaning her shoulder into his. How it doesn't need to be earned again every minute. How it stays unless we chase it away. He considered. We'll still argue, he said, a smile skimming his voice. I'd worry if we didn't, she answered. But we'll argue in daylight. He slipped the watch into his pocket. Time moves even when timepieces don't. And love moves even when people stand still, she said, surprising herself with the simplicity of it. They laughed softly, not at the thought, but at the relief of hearing it aloud. The neighbor's radio found a clear station for once. A song about an ordinary promise climbed the air and lingered. Uri threaded his fingers through hers. We didn't win anything, he said. We just stopped hiding. That's what earning looks like, she replied. Not trophies. A table set for 2 on a gentle day. They sat until the porch boards cooled under their bare feet, and the orchard turned to a quilt of darker greens. When they finally rose, the house welcomed them with the kind of quiet that belongs to people who have told the truth and stayed. On the nightstand, the watch rested without accusation. In the hall, their 2 cups waited to be washed in the morning. Peace didn't announce itself. It hummed. It breathed. It reached into corners the storm never touched and made them kind. And as they lay down, their shoulders touching, Uri felt the steady tide of ordinary love move through the room, soft and persistent, like the sound of leaves remembering wind. The gentle day had done what days can do at their best. It had made room for tomorrow and asked for nothing in return but care.
Sau khi sự thật cuối cùng cũng được phơi bày, Uri và Tu Tieu đi qua một ngôi làng tìm lại sự yên bình. Bà Khai, góa phụ của người giám sát đêm, mang theo một chiếc đồng hồ bỏ túi bị nứt và hỏi liệu công ty có thể hàn gắn sự im lặng đã phá vỡ hay không. Uri không thể hứa, thay vào đó ông cúi đầu. Sáng hôm sau họ đến viếng bàn thờ bà, xin lỗi và nghe được câu trả lời. Giữ bằng chứng ở sảnh, giữ hòa bình trong nhà. Thông qua những hành động khiêm tốn, rót trà, vá còng tay, soạn thảo danh sách kiểm tra an toàn, đồng ý với một quy tắc thử nghiệm, cộng đồng học lại cách lắng nghe. Uri chọn hợp tác thay vì phòng thủ. Thủ tiêu ổn định căn phòng, họ trả lại sổ cái cho hồ sơ công khai, mang theo chiếc đồng hồ như một lời nhắc nhở. Và để ngày làm việc lặng lẽ trong ánh sáng buổi tối, họ ngồi với tình yêu, không phải chiến thắng nhưng trung thực. Sự tha thứ trở thành chuyển động, thời gian chuyển động, những cuộc tranh luận được giữ lại cho ánh sáng bên ngày, và hòa bình được mà không cần chiến lợi phẩm.